It was a stormy night, the kind that makes you grateful for the warmth and safety of your own car. I was driving home from a long day at work, tired and eager to crawl into bed. The rain pounded against the windshield, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. As I navigated the winding roads, I saw her standing on the side of the road, drenched and shivering in the downpour. A hitchhiker. My first instinct was to keep driving, to ignore her and focus on getting home. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way she looked so alone and vulnerable, or maybe it was just the guilt of leaving someone out in the storm. Whatever it was, I found myself slowing down and pulling over to the side of the road. "Need a ride?" I called out through the open window, barely able to hear my own voice over the roar of the rain. She nodded gratefully and hurried over to the car, her wet clothes sticking to her skin. I unlocked the door and she climbed into the passenger seat, sending a cascade of rainwater onto the floor. "Thanks," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded and pulled back onto the road, the wipers working overtime to clear the windshield. I stole a glance at her out of the corner of my eye, trying to get a better look at her in the dim light of the car. She was young, probably no older than 20, with dark hair plastered to her face. She wore a thin jacket that offered little protection from the elements. I couldn't help but wonder what she was doing out here all alone. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to make conversation. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Just a few miles up the road. I'll tell you when to stop." I nodded and fell silent, focusing on the road ahead. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and the visibility was getting worse by the minute. I kept stealing glances at her, feeling a strange sense of unease creeping over me. After what felt like hours, she finally spoke up, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "You can pull over here." I slowed to a stop on the side of the road and turned to look at her. But she was gone, vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but an empty seat and the lingering scent of rain. I blinked in disbelief, my heart pounding in my chest. I got out of the car and searched frantically, calling out into the darkness, but there was no sign of her anywhere. Shaken, I got back into the car and continued on my journey, the memory of the mysterious hitchhiker haunting my thoughts. When I finally got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to push the encounter out of my mind, chalking it up to exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere of the storm. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than I realized. I decided to do some research, scouring the local news archives for any mention of a young woman who had gone missing in the area. And that's when I found it. A newspaper article from 10 years ago, detailing the disappearance of a young woman named Emily. She had been hitchhiking home from a party when she vanished without a trace, her body never found. My blood ran cold as I read the article, realizing that I had picked up a ghost that night, a restless soul condemned to wander the lonely roads for eternity. And as I sat there in my darkened living room, I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever encounter her again, or if she would forever remain a fleeting memory, lost in the darkness of the storm. It was a balmy summer evening, the kind that invites you to roll down the windows and let the warm breeze dance through your hair. I was driving down a quiet country road, the sun sinking low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was the perfect end to a long day, and I couldn't wait to get home and relax. As I rounded a bend in the road, I saw her standing on the shoulder, her thumb outstretched in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with long blonde hair cascading down her back. Despite the fading light, she seemed to glow with an otherworldly radiance. Without much thought, I slowed down and pulled over, rolling down the window to greet her. "Need a ride?" I called out, a friendly smile on my face. She nodded eagerly and hurried over to the car, her eyes sparkling with gratitude. "Thank you so much," she said, sliding into the passenger seat. "I've been waiting out here for ages." I chuckled and pulled back onto the road, stealing glances at her out of the corner of my eye. There was something about her that seemed familiar, yet elusive, like a half-remembered dream. I shook my head, chalking it up to my overactive imagination, and focused on the road ahead. As we drove on, she began to tell me her story. She was a college student, she said, on her way home for the summer. She had been visiting friends in the city and had missed the last bus out of town. Normally, she wouldn't hitchhike, but she was desperate to get home and couldn't afford a cab. I listened intently, nodding along as she spoke. There was a warmth to her voice, a sincerity that drew me in despite my reservations. We chatted about everything and nothing, lost in the easy rhythm of conversation. But as the miles passed, I began to notice something strange. No matter how far we drove, we never seemed to get any closer to her supposed destination. The road stretched on endlessly, twisting and turning through the countryside. I glanced at the dashboard clock, frowning as I realized that hours had passed since I picked her up. "Are we getting close?" I asked, trying to keep the unease out of my voice. She smiled reassuringly. "Just a little further," she said. "We're almost there. I promise." But as we rounded yet another bend in the road, my heart sank. We were back where we started, the same stretch of road stretching out before us. It was as if we were trapped in some kind of endless loop, doomed to drive forever without reaching our destination. Panic began to rise in my chest as I realized that something was terribly wrong. I slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt. "What's going on?" I demanded, turning to face her. But she was gone, vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but an empty seat and the lingering scent of her perfume. I stumbled out of the car, my heart pounding in my chest. I called out into the darkness, searching frantically for any sign of her, but there was nothing, no trace of her presence, no hint of where she had gone. Shaken to my core, I got back into the car and drove home in silence, the memory of the mysterious hitchhiker burning bright in my mind. I tried to push it aside, to tell myself that it was just a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had picked up a ghost that night, a lost soul condemned to wander the lonely roads for eternity. And as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, waiting for someone to give her a ride home. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the deserted highway, I found myself driving alone through the heart of the countryside. It was the kind of desolate road where your headlights are the only source of illumination, and the silence was broken only by the hum of the engine. I had been on the road for hours, my eyelids heavy with exhaustion, when I saw her standing by the side of the road. A hitchhiker. She was a young woman, her long hair blowing in the gentle breeze, and she held out her thumb in a silent plea for a ride. Despite the nagging voice of caution in the back of my mind, I felt compelled to stop. Perhaps it was the loneliness of the road or the empathy I felt for a fellow traveler, but I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Need a lift?" I called out, trying to ignore the unease that crept over me. She nodded gratefully and hurried over to the car, her eyes flashing with gratitude. "Thank you so much," she said, slipping into the passenger seat. "I've been waiting out here for hours." I smiled politely and pulled back onto the road, stealing glances at her out of the corner of my eye. There was something about her that seemed off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Perhaps it was the way she seemed to shimmer in the dim light, or the way her eyes seemed to pierce through me. We fell into an uneasy silence as we drove on, the only sound the rumble of the tires against the asphalt. I tried to make conversation, but she only responded with vague, monosyllabic answers. As we neared what she claimed was her destination, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, the same barren landscape passing by in a monotonous blur. "Are we getting close?" I asked, my voice tinged with anxiety. She smiled cryptically. "Almost there," she said, her voice sending shivers down my spine. But as we rounded yet another bend in the road, my heart sank. We were back where we started, the same stretch of highway stretching out before us. It was as if we were trapped in some kind of twisted maze, doomed to drive in circles for all eternity. Panic began to rise in my chest as I realized that something was terribly wrong. I slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt. "What's going on?" I demanded, turning to face her, but she was gone, vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but an empty seat and the faint scent of lilacs. I stumbled out of the car, my heart pounding in my chest. I called out into the darkness, searching frantically for any sign of her, but there was nothing. No trace of her presence, no hint of where she had gone. Shaken to my core, I got back into the car and drove home in silence, the memory of the mysterious hitchhiker burning bright in my mind. I tried to push it aside, to tell myself that it was just a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by fatigue. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but smile. Perhaps she wasn't a ghost after all, but a guardian angel sent to remind me of the power of compassion and kindness. And as I closed my eyes, I knew that I would never forget the strange encounter on that lonely highway, a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary moments can lead to the most extraordinary experiences.